Hello, troublemakers. Welcome to this week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast. I am your host, Lynn Fields, and this week we will be highlighting Joe Hill. Joel Emmanuel Hogland was born October 7th, 1879. Shout out to the Libras in Sweden. He had 8 siblings. 3 of them died at a young age. He learned to paint and play music, from his parents, and he lived in his town was like a small port town. His family was devoutly Lutheran. His father Olaf worked as a railroad conductor. His parents both enjoyed music and passed this love along to Joel and his siblings. Joe used to make up songs about the family, kind of like Weird Al Yankovic. He liked to go to the concerts at the Workers Association Hall, and he played piano, banjo, and guitar at a local cafe sometimes. In 1887, his dad died in a workplace accident, so the kids had to join the workforce to make ends meet. Joe, at the age of 9, worked in a rope factory, and later as a fireman on a steam powered crane. In 1900, Joe came down with skin and joint tuberculosis. So skin tuberculosis kind of starts off as these bumps that kind of lump together on your skin, and they eventually burst and form abscesses that leak, dead tissue and discharge. And joint tuberculosis is a muscular skeletal, form of tuberculosis, and it was a common cause of infectious arthritis in developing countries. And this is what I learned from the Google. Joe moved to Stockholm in search of a cure. He worked a bunch of odd jobs while he went through radiation treatment. And these, surgeries and radiation, they caused his face and neck to be really disfigured and scarred. His mom, Katharina, died after getting a bunch of surgeries for some back pain that she was having. After she died, the remaining 6 children sold the family home and parted ways. 4 of the siblings stayed in Sweden. Joe, went to his baby brother Paul, they were the closest, and he was like, how about we just go to the U.S.? And so Paul and Joe went to the U.S. in 1902. Joe was 23 at this time. He became, an itinerant laborer. This basically means that, he just bounced around working a lot of different odd jobs for short periods of time, in different places, usually outdoor work. I'd imagine this gave him the opportunity to see more of the U.S. without being tied down. Now, we can't pin down his exact movements specifically, but we do know that he worked in Chicago, at first, where he worked in a machine shop. And here is, when he got fired because he started talking union shit. And so the bosses blacklisted Joel Hogland. And here he became Joe Hillstrom, because remember, Joel is on the blacklist for jobs. Joe is not. He's shown in Cleveland in 1905 and in San Francisco in April of 1906 during the Great Earthquake. And then he shows up in San Pedro, California in 1910. Here is where he joins the International Workers of the World. Shout out to the Wobblies. So, troublemakers, let's put a pin in Joe's story real quick, because we need to break down the Wobblies. IWW, International Workers of the World. They are an international labor union founded in Chicago in 1905. Now, we don't know exactly how they got their nickname, the Wobblies, but, there's a few theories that float around. So, one of the theories is that, there was a Chinese worker in Canada who would extend credit to IWW members, and that this person, he couldn't pronounce the W in, with the, for the workers. So he would say, when he would ask them about their membership status, he would say something along the lines when he would ask them, he would say, I Lou Wobble Wobble. So the story goes they started referring to themselves as the Wobblies. Now, this story, again, it might be true, it might not be true, but, as the Wobblies, the IWW, they were the first union in North America that didn't discriminate against the Chinese or Chinese Americans. And this likely wouldn't have, gone unnoticed by the Chinese community. But the person had told this story. His name was Mortimer Downing. And a lot of people, they say that Mortimer, this story, it's like really racist because even the way you have this person talking to you, like this is 1911 or whatever, even by 1911 standards, when he's repeating this story, it sounded kind of cartoonish and racist. So a lot of people call cap on Mortimer's theory. So theory number 2 of how the Wobblies got their name is, they said that they would usually, or, the IWW, they usually organized unskilled immigrant workers who had a large presence in sawmills. And that, like, when they would get pissed off about something, they would, like, make the saws wobble and that make the work go slower. And so they're saying that, that also was one of the theories. But again, no proof. Forgive me with these theories, troublemakers. It's just that I went down a rabbit hole because I really, really wanted to know how they got this name. So another theory is that it was born out of a term for wobbling the works, which means that, they would do an action on the job. The Wobblies were known for throwing a fit when they didn't have their way, and they'd make the saws again, wobble and then sabotage the work. But to be fair, the Wobblies were called all kinds of stuff. Some called them the International Wonder Workers, and they were called the I Want Works. There's even a theory that they were called the I Want Whiskey because bosses said they could always tell the IWW members because they were the ones that would wobble when they walk. So the first convention was held in Chicago. There was about 200 socialists, anarchists, and Marxists, and a bunch of other radical trade unionists, and they were there to promote solidarity, and their motto was, an injury to one is an injury to all. They organized because they felt that at the time, the AFL had failed to effectively represent the working class and that they were causing a separation by organizing by jobs and trades instead of just making one working class. So in 1910, Joe joins the IWW. He's in San Pedro, California, and he's serving as their secretary. It's here where he, writes some of his most popular songs. So like he gets this reputation as, a songwriter. And one of his most popular songs is The Preacher and the Slave and Casey Jones, A Union Scab. Y'all, I'm just going to put this out here. Casey Jones, A Union Scab is my absolute favorite Joe Hill banger. Like, just think about, a union diss track. So workers, just a little backstory. So some workers at Harrison and Illinois Central Railroad, which included Southern Pacific, some of these workers had walked out on the job, but the engineers, they continued to work. And this undermined the workers' ability to negotiate. So Casey Jones, the story goes, was killed when his passenger train collided with a freight train. Legend has it that he died with his brake cord still in his hand. He became a legend, amongst the railroad workers, and one of the workers even wrote a song called Casey Jones, and it was like really melodic, and it painted him as a hero. But Joe didn't appreciate the fact that, when Casey was killed, he was scabbing. So Joe was like, fuck Casey, never them. And he wrote Casey Jones, A Union Scab. So troublemakers, I am not going to sing this song, but I am going, and I'm not going to read all of the lyrics, but I'm just going to give y'all just a little bit of what Joe's writing style was like. So this is from Casey Jones, A Union Scab. And he talks about how Casey, was scabbing, when he died, and he died in this horrible accident. And then he goes into, quote, when Casey Jones got to heaven, to the pearly gate, He said, "I'm Casey Jones, the guy that pulled the SP freight." "You're just the man," said Peter. "Our musicians went on strike. You can get a job of scabbing anytime you like." The Angels got together and they said it wasn't fair for Casey Jones to go around a scabbing everywhere. The Angels Union number 23, they sure were there. And they promptly fired Casey down the golden stair. Casey Jones went to hell a flying. Casey Jones, the devil said, "Oh fine." Casey Jones, get busy shuffling sulfur. That's what you get for scabbing on the SP line. Bars, bars, troublemakers. His songs appeared in the IWW Red Book of Songs, which of course you can still buy today. And Joe was really busy, y'all. In 1911, we find him in Tijuana, Mexico, where he was part of a failed attempt to overthrow a Mexican dictator. And in 1912, he was active, in San Diego during a protest because the city had closed down the streets to street meetings. It was even reported that Joe was at a railroad construction crew site in British Columbia where he lent support to Italian dock workers. He was actually arrested here for vagrancy and given 30 days in the clink. He later said he was, quote, "a little too active to suit the chief." That's the kind of sense of humor that Joe had. So after Joe was released, he headed to Utah. Now, it's important to remember that right before Joe hit Utah, the Wobblies had just been involved in a downtown Salt Lake City riot. So the IWW had won a strike against the Utah Construction Company. But some of the strikers had ended up in jail after a fight with private security guards, and, there was like some gunshots that had rang out. So IWW popularity was pretty low when Joe got to town. Joe came into town with a buddy named Otto Applequist. Joe and Otto stayed with some friends of theirs, John and Ed Acelius, in Murray, Utah. Murray was a small, impoverished community, a small, tight-knit Swedish community. So Joe came into town with his buddy, and, they're staying with the cousins, and they kind of made roots there. So like Joe found a job, working at Silver King Mine, and then Otto found work as a steel worker. Like they got so comfortable that Otto even managed to start dating one of the female cousins of the friends, and he got engaged to her. Her name was Hilda Erickson. So I'm just going to stop right here, y'all, and just let y'all know, it's giving that it sounds like Otto and Joe were like hobosexuals. Like y'all know who a hobosexual, somebody who they just want to go live with somebody. They really don't have any roots, so they'll go live with somebody, hang out with them, and date them so that they can have a place to stay. But it's giving hobosexual. On January 10th, 1914, a grocer named John G. Morrison and his teenage son Arling were killed. It was reported that two masked men barged into the store around 10 p.m. and shot them. This attack was witnessed by John's 13-year-old son, Merlin. The boy stated that his father managed to shoot one of the robbers.
Hey, this is Carmen Rodriguez from El Cafecito del Día. At LACLA, we are proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speaks. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
Merlin reported that he thinks that his dad shot one of the robbers in the shoulder, and that, both of the robbers had red bandanas over their face. Around 11:30 p.m. that same night, Joe showed up at the home office of a Dr. Frank McHugh. He'd been shot in the chest. When the doctor asked what happened, Joe was like, "I got shot, I was arguing over a woman, but just, keep this between us. Just keep quiet. It was a fight about a girl." He would continue to insist where and why he got wounded was, quote, nobody's business but his. Now, another doctor, riding down the street, his name was Arthur Bird. He stopped by Dr. McHugh's house when he saw his lights on. Now, he actually ended up driving Joe back to his buddy's house around 1 a.m. Now, the cousins reported that Otto and Joe, that when Joe got back, that he and Otto spoke privately for a few minutes. And then Otto came back into the room and was like, hey, y'all, I'm not going to be around here anymore. I'm going to go look for some work elsewhere. And Otto left. And as a matter of fact, he was never seen again. Now, when Dr. McHugh when they found out about the killing at the grocery store earlier that night, he called the police and reported that he had treated Joe Hill for a gunshot wound. And Joe was arrested on that Tuesday. So the crime happened on Sunday. Joe was arrested on Tuesday. The police searched for Otto, but again, Otto was in the wind. Joe was booked on Wednesday, and 13-year-old Merlin came to Joe's cell and told police that Joe had, quote, the same build, end quote, as one of the killers. Now remember, he never saw his face because the killers had masks on. The police were geeked up when they found out that Joe wasn't just any wobbly. He was the writer of the songs the protesters were singing months earlier at the protest in Salt Lake City when all hell broke loose. So Joe bonded out at his preliminary hearing, and the trial started in June. Joe was represented by Ernest McDougal and Frank B. Scott. Joe, we're assuming that he didn't run because basically he believed that the prosecution's case was weak sauce, like it was completely circumstantial. But young Merlin was the first to take the stand. He stated on a stack of Bibles that Hill's, quote, general build, height, form of body, and shape of head was that of one of the killers, end quote, because that's how 13-year-olds talk. On the third day of the trial, Joe openly fired his attorneys and said he could do a better job himself. But testimony continued despite Joe's objections. And in the end, Joe said, look, just let him stay. I don't even care anymore. Now, another thing that was going on during this trial, because remember, y'all, this is before cable, so ain't shit to do but go to people's trials, I guess, was that there were two women that kept showing up on every day of the trial. One of them was Virginia Snow Stephen. She was the daughter of Latter-day Saints president Lorenzo Snow. She was an art professor at University of Utah and, a prominent member. She was prominent in the Salt Lake City social circles. She was basically Paris Hilton, and she was adamant that Joe was innocent. The other woman that kept showing up at the trial every day was Hilda Erickson. Y'all remember Hilda, right? She was the girlfriend of Otto. Now, yep, Otto's fiance. So let's just start calling her the ex-fiance because remember, Otto is gone. Reporters, they already know who Virginia is. But then when they asked Joe's attorneys who Hilda was, they were just like, look, we don't know this woman. And they complained because when they asked Joe who she was, they said that he would, quote, shut up like a clam. Despite Hill having no motive, the whole case was based on the fact that he was shot on the same night the grocer was killed. There was no definite identification, and his attorneys were incompetent. Joe, didn't help his case by not providing an alibi, which he just kept insisting it was nobody's business why he was shot and where he was. So 99.7% of the population believed that he was protecting the reputation of Hilda. In the end, Joe was convicted of murder on June 27th, 1914. He was sentenced on July 8th, and he chose the firing squad. The International Workers of the World immediately started a letter writing campaign. Like, people were writing letters from all over the country. Even Helen Keller herself, she was writing in letters begging for mercy for Joe Hill. Protests were held around the country. Union halls drafted resolutions and sent petitions. Governor William Spry heard from people against the death penalty and for the death penalty, and he himself even got a few death threats. And he also got letters complimenting him on how well he handled the case, including letters of praise from William Pinkerton of the punk-ass Pinkerton Private Security Company. Joe continued to write songs and articles for wobbly publications. He sent a telegram to IWW leader Bill Haywood. He said, "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time mourning. Organize." End quote. Joe's appeal to the Utah Supreme Court, it was denied on July 3rd, 1915. His plea for computation was denied by the Utah Board of Pardons on September 18th, 1915. No surprise there. Within hours of his execution on October 1st, President Woodrow Wilson sent a telegram to Governor Spry, and he asked for postponement so that the Swedish minister could examine the case. Governor Spry agreed to this, but shortly after Joe's 36th birthday, when the stay was denied, it was on November 19th, 1915, the morning of his execution. When they came to wake him up, Joe started fighting the Utah correctional officers like a real wildcat, like it was a scrap. He was going to go down. I guess he figured, if I'm going to die, everybody getting this smoke. He was eventually subdued. And as he marched out, he was marched out onto the prison yard, and his family and friends who had come to watch, of course, they were denied coming in by the warden. They were standing on the outside wall. And as Joe was being escorted out, he yelled out, "I'm going now, boys." The guards strapped him down in the chair and blindfolded him. The story goes that as the commander was yelling out the commands of ready, aim, Joe interjected and yelled out, "Fire! Go on and fire!" There were 4 riflemen. 3 bullets pierced his heart, and the 4th one was off to the side a little bit. The program from his funeral read, quote, "Murdered by the state authorities by the state of Utah." Before he had died, Joe had sent out another telegram, and it read, "Could you have my body hauled to the state line to be buried? I don't want to be found dead in Utah." His body was cremated in Chicago. His ashes were separated into 600 small envelopes. On November 19th, 1916, 1 year after his execution, and on the 10th annual IWW convention, delegates got the envelopes, and the rest of the envelopes were sent to IWW locals around the world. According to Joe's will, he wanted to have his ashes spread in gardens all around the world, with the exception of Utah. In 1949, 34 years after Joe was executed, Hilda Erickson told a writer named Aubrey Hahn that her ex-fiance, Otto Appelquist, is the one that shot Joe. Otto and Hilda had been broken up for about a week, and she started seeing Joe. She claims that Joe was messing around and making fun of Otto, the, "Hey, just call me Mr. Steal Your Girl." And Otto got pissed and shot him. But Otto and Joe were really good friends. And in fact, Otto is the one that took Joe to the doctor's office to be seen. Now, after this story came out that Hilda, told, y'all remember Virginia, the other woman that kept coming to the trial every day? She was like, "No, I do not believe this." And she's actually on record saying that everyone knew that Joe's life was at stake and that any regular, ordinary girl would have spoken up had they known that it would have saved Joe's life. But this is where I'm just like, okay, Virginia, you're saying that this woman, she's saying that, that they couldn't have had a relationship. But how do you know? Because now it's sounding like, okay, if she's a regular ordinary girl would have spoke up, but he would have only been protecting somebody that has some status. So who would have had some status? You would have had some status, Virginia. So was Joe giving the sex to Virginia and Helga? Like, because, it's giving fuck boy. I mean, cover your ears, but yeah. Because, like, I'm thinking, like, DJs, AutoZone workers, dudes that work at AutoZone, and, labor singers. Like, I don't know, maybe they have like this little fan base or whatever. But Virginia, you sitting here outright calling this lady a liar. Like, this is her story to tell. So why wouldn't it be true? So that's just Lynn's little messy theory. In 1988, one of the envelopes was with Joe's ashes in it was found at a post office in Chicago. The ashes were turned over to the Chicago IWW chapter, but not the envelope because petty. Joe's ashes were spread, finally, the last of his ashes were spread across Canada, Sweden, Australia, and Nicaragua, and the U.S. Again, with the exception of Utah. And that's my take on the story of Joe Hill. So now, troublemakers, we are in the part of the show where I give my flowers. And this week, I'm going to give my flowers to Joe Jinks. So I know that, some of you that listen all the way to the end, you guys hear a song called We Won playing us out, right? And I just want to tell you guys that, like, I met Joe Jinks a few years ago at Labor Notes, a labor conference that's done every other year in Chicago. And I met Joe, and he's a musician. And he gave me his CD, and on the way home, I listened to this song, and I heard We Won, and I absolutely fell in love with it. So when I decided to do this podcast, I reached out to him, and I asked him for permission to use that song. And he, like, with no hesitation, he said, yes, sister, like, just give the writer of the song, John O'Connor, credit, because that's what we do, right? We give credit to the people who do the work. Joe helped me to, flesh out this podcast. He makes it feel, him letting me use that song, it makes the podcast feel whole and complete. And I absolutely want to give my thanks to him. Now, Joe is actually a member of the AFM Local 1000, North American Traveling Musicians Union. And he's been singing folk songs and union music for well over 20 years. He shared with me that the person that, made him fall in love with music was actually, when he was 5 years old, his first music teacher was an African-American woman that really instilled the value of music in him. Joe is a really good guy. If you ever get a chance to hear him perform live, then lucky you. Thank you, Joe Jinks. So, troublemakers, that's the end of the show. Don't forget to follow us, like us, share us, and more importantly, rate us. Again, if you don't like what you hear, just tell somebody you don't like and waste their time. As always, peace and solidarity. This week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast is produced by The Create Place Studio. You can find them on all social media platforms at The Create Place STL. We Won is performed by Joe Jinks and written by John O'Connor. This has been Resolved Labor Podcast. As always, peace and solidarity.
Everybody come and join in the union. Begin. Stand together to overcome soon.